Hello everyone, welcome to the Force Plate Coach YouTube channel. My name is John McMahon, and in this video I'm going to talk about the importance of weighing athletes every time we test them when we use a force plate. So let's get straight into it. So first of all, body weight in the past has been one of those overlooked things that sometimes practitioners would rush through and not quantify when coming to test their athletes in each of the different tests that they may do on a force plate. It's really important that we don't overlook it, and I'm going to explain in this video why that's the case. So before I do that, I'm just going to explain how we actually quantify body weight, ideally based on what the research suggests is the criteria and methods of doing so. So to begin with, we want to first of all shout out Hawkin Dynamics for allowing us to use their force plates picture in this video. So you can see their Twitter and Instagram handle there on the screen. So if you've not checked those guys out, then please go and do so, because they're a fantastic company, and more importantly, they've got some great people who work for them. So thank you again to Hawkin Dynamics. So when we come and test our athletes, if you're doing something like a counter movement jump or a counter movement rebound jump, we want to make sure that the athletes begin by being stood completely upright. Now, I'm just going to talk about 2 points in relation to this. First of all, making sure that athletes remain upright in these type of jumps is something that actually isn't that well documented in the scientific literature, and in my experience it hasn't been spoken about much in the different conferences in terms of the speakers and things that do this sort of presentation in the past. And the reason we say to keep upright is because when we come to do some more sophisticated analysis with this data, and we hopefully then are able to quantify the position of the athlete with respect to time during that jump, the assumption is that the centre of mass height, so for those that don't know, the centre of mass is about the height of the belly button for most of us. The assumption is that we're going to set that position to 0. And then any movement that we see when we squat down, say during the counter movement phase for example, and then any whereby we exceed our standing height, is going to be considered a negative position, so descending, and then a positive position, ascending, in those two different situations respectively. And so it's really important that we make sure athletes remain upright for those type of jumps. The reason that the asterisk is there is because, of course, some tests on a force plate will require the athletes to start in a squatted position. So for example, if you're doing a squat jump test where you adopt a squat position and you maybe hold that for 3 seconds before you commence the jump, then you want to kind of hold that position level, and then any positional change will be made from that squat position that they're currently in. And then the same applies for things like isometric mid-thigh pull and isometric squats. Look, you're going to be in a squatted position, but it doesn't matter because there's no movement occurring during those tests because it's isometric, and therefore this positional element doesn't matter from a calculation standpoint because we won't be doing that anyway. It's more just making sure that in the jumps where they're supposed to be upright, like the counter movement jump, the different multiple rebound jump tests, or even at the end of a drop jump in some cases, which I'll talk about in a later video, it's important to make sure that they're upright. Second thing is, we usually instruct athletes to keep their hands on their hips. And the reason we do that is because the force plate can't distinguish between which part of the body is actually applying that force to the plate. All it's actually seeing is the forces that are being applied down into that force plate system at a centre of mass level, and therefore, like I said in one of my earlier videos, the forces that are being imparted back on that athlete's centre of mass to propel them upwards in a jumping case, for example. So if we were just to stand there and swing our arms up and down while the force plate was recording data, it will show a change in force production, obviously because we've got some acceleration that's occurring due to the forces we're producing with our upper body. And so what we don't want to do is have that captured within our force plate records for most athletes, because everyone will swing their arms in a slightly different way, and it might distort where the kind of peaks and the average of these braking and propulsion phases of the jumps will occur by virtue of swinging the arms at a slightly different timing. And equally, athletes aren't particularly great, even within themselves, at repeatedly swinging their arms in a similar fashion every time that we test them. And so if we try to minimise the noise and the error associated with the data that we're collecting, so that we've got some sensitive variables that we can monitor going forward with our athletes, then removing arm swing is probably a sensible option. However, if you work with a jump dominant sport like basketball or volleyball, it may be that you're then testing the jumps because the jumping aspect's important to that sport, and obviously athletes aren't going to jump with their hands on hips in a sporting scenario. And so my recommendations for people that work with those type of athletes is to consider collecting, say, 3 counter movement jumps with hands on hips, because for the reasons I mentioned before, that will kind of give you that ability just to isolate those lower limbs force production, and it'll give you a better comparison most likely to the normative data if you're interested in exploring that as well. But then maybe consider doing 3 trials with arm swing as well, if you're interested in the jump because it's a jump, if that makes sense. And just on that note, actually, if anyone's wondering what I'm talking about, It's not always the fact that it's a jump that we're interested in when it comes to doing jump tests on a force plate, and I know that might seem like an alien thing to say to some of you guys watching, but it's what we can get from those jump tests that's more important. So it's how it informs how athletes' neuromuscular function has adapted over time, either acutely in response to, say, short duration match plays, or short mesocycles, for example, or over a longer period of time as well. So it isn't about the jump per se. So if anyone's asking why they're doing a jump test in a sport that's not jump dominant, like rugby for example, then it's probably for those different reasons. But if you are in a jump dominant sport, obviously the jump tests are a little bit more obvious in terms of why they're being included. Right. The other thing is, I would say trying to adopt a hip width stance is advisable, or at the most a shoulder width stance on the force plate. Now my stick figure on the graph that you can see right now isn't really kind of on the force plates as well as you would like. Hopefully you guys would be a little bit more central to the plates, but you hopefully get the picture. The reason I say hip width is because these force plates are mostly going to measure vertical only ground reaction force component. And because we're trying to direct our centre of mass vertically, it makes sense to have the feet a little bit closer and align with the hips to make sure that the forces we're producing aren't going off at a tangent, and they're hopefully going to be directed in that vertical direction to help further propel our athletes up higher into the air if we're doing a jump test, for example. Now, if you've not really adopted a hip width stance before and you coach your athletes to do that, you might expect their initial performance to reduce. So I wouldn't necessarily change their stance, especially if you're already feeding into a database for those athletes. You maybe, if they're going hip to shoulder width anyway, just keep that as it is. If it's new athletes though, then I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea for these types of tests to coach a hip width stance from the offset. So if you're kind of working with athletes for the first time that haven't done any jump testing, and you're going to embed some of this jump based work into their training programs like the warm-ups or whatever prior to doing the jump testing, then a hip width stance might be a suitable way forward. The important thing is when you're doing your weighing is to make sure that you try and distribute your weight evenly between your feet. That will be picked up especially if you've got a dual force plate system like you can see in this Hawkin Dynamics example right here. And from one of the earlier videos you'll see that the way we denote force is usually with an arrow of a given magnitude and a direction denoted by the arrowhead. So in this example, if you've got the athlete that's got an even weight distribution between feet on each plate, you've got those two vectors there that are equal in magnitude and are also orientated in the same vertical direction. And then we get the athletes to stay still for at least a second. And that's based on work going all the way back to 2001, so 20 years ago now, by Street et al. And they looked at weighing athletes over different periods, and they found that about a second is going to give us a good estimation of the athlete's body weight. Anything less than that is starting to deviate from what that athlete's true body weight might be. And you guys may have seen, for those that have read any of the research that people are doing on force plate testing in the past 3 to 5 years, most people now will weigh for at least 1 second. So it's advisable that you do the same. If you weigh for longer than 1 second, it's not particularly a problem. I would say you just need to consider when you're going to start your numerical integration, because the longer that we have the force plate running for, the more we get drift in our force plate signal. And again, I'll cover that more in a later video. So for the most part, stay still for a second, or if you stay still for more than a second, you can just scan that initial force time record and identify where that 1 second is that you're going to take to weigh your particular athlete. So if we were to then get that force registered equally between those 2 feet, we'd sum those two together, and that would give us the athlete's body weight. So in this example here, you can see the athlete's got a body weight of 766 newtons. And for those that don't know what the difference between weight and mass is, weight is just our body mass multiplied by gravitational acceleration, and that is usually about 9.81 meters per second squared. So body weight is a force, it's therefore a vector. Body mass is a scalar, so you can think of this as just, it's the same as body mass really, acutely. Like whatever we weigh in kilos, we can multiply by 9.81 and we'll convert it to our approximate body weight. Just on that note though, it's not advisable when you come to use a force plate system that you input the athlete's body weight from measuring them on, say, some weighing scales separately in the gym, and by doing that conversion that you can see there on the screen. And I did put in that very opening slide of this video that we weigh the athlete every single time we test them. And that's for these following reasons, okay? So the whys. The whys are, we use that weight to identify the start of the jump, that might be, for example. And we also use it to go into our forward dynamics procedures to end up feeding forward all the way through to displacement or position, like I said before, and that's why we get the athletes to stand upright as well. and it also considers signal noise. And so the reason we set the athletes on a weighing phase for at least a second every time they step on the plates is because if you look at the graph up here on the left hand side, what you can see is on that very zoomed in vertical axis there, that the athletes are never going to stay perfectly still. On top of that, the force plate is also going to have an inherent noise within its signal as it's registering that data as well. And so you can see there that the average line at 766 newtons that you can see as that grey horizontal line going across the graph is the average weight or force across that first 1 second when the athlete stood upright and still. But you can see that these peaks and troughs all the way through that 1 second period. So this doesn't really just weigh the athlete, it's a product of the athlete's weight, assuming that they stood as still as possible, and any natural noise within that system. Every time we zero the force plate, there's going to be a slightly different noise potentially within that system. Every time we set the force plates in a different position, or we turn them off and turn them back on again, there's going to be the potential for a slightly different noise in that system. So the reason we weigh the athletes every single time is because that 1 second weighing phase might not actually be exactly the athlete's weight, but it's the athlete's weight on that system at that time with the associated signal noise. And then we take care of that, we consider it when it comes to identifying the starting our forward dynamics procedures, because it does consider that signal noise. And that's why really what we shouldn't be doing is taking weight just from, say, getting the athletes to stand still for a second as a separate trial on the force plate system, and then apply that body weight to every single test that they do thereafter. So hopefully that stresses the point of why weighing the athletes is important, and why we don't just do it using the scales multiplied by 9.81 meters per second squared, and why we don't just test our athletes' weight once and apply it to all subsequent trials that we make. Okay, thank you for watching the video. Like I always say, my Twitter and Instagram handle are there on the screen, @ForcePlateCoach. If you do want to reach out to ask any questions, then please do. I am going to work my way through some of the messages I've received over the past couple of weeks and start getting back to people either via messages or with their permission, maybe discuss some of the things that they've raised in their messages to me on the channel instead. Alright, so take care, I'll speak to you soon.